And today we are going to be talking about periodization.
Periodization is really another way of saying the modern approach to organizing training.
All of us have heard of periodization, but what actually is it?
Testing. Powerlifting is a sport where the goal is simple. Lift as much as possible in the squat, the bench press, and the deadlift. But behind the scenes, powerlifters follow meticulously designed programs, often written by other coaches. Now, these training programs involve systematically planned training aimed at reaching peak performance at very specific times by varying training variables such as volume, intensity, and modality.
Periodization.
Now, this process is called periodization. Periodization isn't just a training methodology or a programming style. It's really a description of how we manipulate the nature of training dose across time. And it's not so much about whether we use it, but how we implement it. So welcome to the beginner's guide to powerlifting periodization. But to understand periodization, we have to go back to the origins. Now, our story begins in the early 20th century with this guy here, Hans Selye, a pioneering endocrinologist born in Vienna, Austria-Hungary. Now, he earned an MD from the German University of Prague in 1929 and a PhD in organic chemistry in 1931. Now, he conducted postdoctoral research at the Institute of Pathology at the University of Prague from 1931 to 1932. Then from 1932, he worked at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore and later at McGill University in Montreal from 1934. Now, it is at 1936 where he then published his groundbreaking paper that he is best known for, a syndrome produced by diverse innocuous agents in the Nature journal. He documents his work on general adaptation syndrome, or GAS for short, which basically describes how the body responds to stress. Now, Selye conducted experiments that led to a fundamental understanding of how our bodies react to stresses. Selye's experiments often involved exposing rats to various stresses, such as extreme temperatures, forced exercise, surgical injury, exposure to toxins, physical restraints, as well as electric shocks. He observed that rats initially showed signs of shock, characterized by the activation of the body's fight or flight response, and this was the alarm reaction stage. As the exposure continued, the rats began to adapt, physiological responses stabilize, and the body starts to repair any damage caused during the alarm stage, and this was the resistance stage. However, if the stress was prolonged or too intense, the rats eventually became exhausted. Prolonged exposure to the stressor eventually depleted the body's resources, which eventually leads to the exhaustion phase. Selye's model was groundbreaking because it provided a framework for understanding how stress, and more importantly, recovery, impacts our ability to adapt and grow. And conclusively, he summarizes GAS into 3 stages: the alarm stage, the resistance stage, and the exhaustion stage. By understanding how the body responds to stress through these stages, we can then appreciate that physical training is simply another form of stress. And by knowing how our body responds to stress, we can appreciate the idea that training stress needs to be constantly pushed and pulled through time. Ultimately, with this understanding of stress, we can better manipulate training variables to optimize performance and adaptation. And this concept would later be adapted by sports scientists to develop periodization concepts and models for training. But let's fast forward to the mid-20th century. Now, the Soviet Union was at the forefront of sports science, driven by the desire to dominate in international sports competitions around the world. It was here that the principles of periodizations were really formalized. Soviet scientists like Dr. Leonid Matveyev, often referred to as the father of periodization, built upon Selye's work to publish a model of long-term training planning, often known as classical or traditional periodization. Now, Matveyev's original model, developed from his dissertation, was crafted by monitoring Soviet athletes as they prepared for the 1952 and the 1956 Olympic Games, focusing primarily on track and field events. He was particularly intrigued why some athletes delivered their peak performance at the Summer Olympic Games while others did not. In 1965, based on this extensive research, Matveyev published some work which introduced and elaborated on periodization concepts. They introduced the concept of dividing training into cycles or periods, each with specific focus and goals. Now, his work became popular, and common use of classical periodization grew in the West. Even though the concept of periodization is often attributed to Matveyev, this is actually a misconception. Dating back to around 1000 BC in ancient China, there were mentions of different ages training with different exercises. There were even mentions of forms of exercise, including weight training, that was balanced with rest. Fast forward to 250 CE in ancient Greece, there were mentions of early periodization and programming procedures too. There were also accounts of heavy and light days, recovery and intense general training, followed by specialized training leading up to the Olympic Games. But that was history. On top of general adaptation syndrome, there are other concepts that are central to periodization. Now, the first one is going to be the stimulus fatigue, recovery and adaptation theory, which you can see builds on top of the GAS theory. Fundamentally, this theory shows a similar curve whereby after the imposed stimulus, you get an initial bout of fatigue which drops the performance. When recovery is allowed, your performance can go back up to baseline, and then you can supercompensate to create new adaptations. Fundamentally, the greater the magnitude of workload, the more fatigue that you will build up. This means that you will need longer to recover fully so that adaptations can occur. Now, when we break down this stimulus fatigue recovery adaptation curve, we find that they are really the sum of two groups of effects that occur after an initial bout of stimulus. These are biological processes which hinder the expression of performance, which we call fatigue, and then there are these biological processes that actually lead to the improved performance. These are fitness, and it's the superposition of both of these effects which give rise to the real-time performance curve. This is the fitness fatigue paradigm or theory. The problem is, not all training stimuli create the same adaptations in the body. Now, performing bouts of endurance training is obviously not going to create the same effect as lifting heavy weights in the gym. There are very specific adaptations that happen centrally and locally in the body. Now, this is the SAID principle, which is the specific adaptations on imposed demand. Now, these are some of the core ideas behind periodization, where training modality, volume and intensity changes over long durations or months or years. Now, moving on to how periodization looks like across time. The traditional periodization models often program training in sports for quadrennial cycles and training years. Now, these training years can be broken down into periods. A single training year is often broken down into phases, macrocycles, mesocycles, and microcycles. A macrocycle could span a few months to an entire year and be made up of a number of mesocycles. A mesocycle might last a few weeks to a few months, and they are made of microcycles. A microcycle will typically 1 week long and be made up of training sessions, and each training cycle has a distinct purpose. For example, a macrocycle might include periods of high volume training to build work capacity or muscle, followed by periods of high intensity to peak strength and power, leading into a competition of sorts. This strategic approach allows athletes to maximize their performance towards competition season while minimizing the risk of overtraining. Nowadays, periodization is common practice in strength and conditioning as well as sports coaching. Researchers have conducted numerous studies to understand its influence and refine its application. However, the vast majority of research into periodization are generally short-term in nature, lasting a matter of a few weeks. The general consensus in the research community seems to be apparent. Periodization is effective for optimizing athletic performance and preventing injuries through allowing flexibility for variables to be manipulated. Now, periodization helps in managing fatigue and reducing the risk of overtraining. Studies have shown that short-term structured periodized training leads to greater improvements in performance compared to non-periodized training. Greg Knuckles in an article says, periodized training seems to produce faster and larger strength gains than non-periodized training, regardless of the training status. It's not going to be a night and day difference, but it does seem to have a pretty consistent, meaningful effect. But the thing is, there isn't just one way to periodize your training. In fact, there are several periodization models, each with its own unique structure on how you would manipulate volume and intensity. Now, let's look at a few most common ones that are used. We have linear periodization, which is the most straightforward. It starts with high volume and low intensity and gradually progresses to lower volume and higher intensity as you approach competition. And then we also have block periodization, which divides the training cycle into blocks, each dedicated to specific attributes, for example, hypertrophy or strength. Now, each block builds upon the previous one to enhance overall performance, which is often referred to as phase potentiation. Then we have different forms of nonlinear periodization or undulating periodization, which varies and oscillates the volume and intensity up and down way more frequently, often weekly or daily. Now, one day you might focus on slightly higher reps and low intensity, and the next day you may shift onto low reps and high intensity. Now, many coaches and advanced athletes will use a combination of these models where periodization models are superimposed. Nowadays, this is pretty common practice. Nearly every cookie cutter program that you can find on the internet will have various periodization models being used. So at the end of the day, using different periodization models allows for more flexibility for coaches to fine-tune small variables to create more optimal outcome. Now, before I answer that question, if you guys do like this video, it would be amazing if you guys could like this video. And if you want to see more stuff like this, please subscribe to this channel, as it really helps out the channel loads. Now back to topic. Traditional periodization is a top-down approach, meaning that it involves planning the entire training cycle well in advance, often over months or sometimes even a year. Outside of powerlifting, this makes a lot of sense for organizational sports like team sports, and sports where there are multiple complex skills and physiological qualities needed, whether it's track and field, tennis, rugby, etc. However, for powerlifting, the qualities and skills for powerlifting are very simple. They are the movements needed for powerlifting, which is simply the squat, bench and deadlift, and the qualities needed for powerlifting is simply muscle mass and strength. So how does this difference influence how we periodize training for powerlifting? The nature of powerlifting training really does not vary that much when compared to other sports. For the vast majority of the year, powerlifters will just be training consistently to increase muscle mass and increase strength simultaneously, while having very slight changes and variations in exercise selection. The biggest problem with having a top-down approach to periodization, where long-term training is mapped out, is that it assumes that you can predict the response to the stimulus that you're about to impose. Now, this rigid structure to a traditional top-down approach to programming can fail to account for the individual variability in response to the max strength training and unexpected life events. Fixed cycles and predetermined progressions may not adapt well to the unique needs of each athlete or their day-to-day conditions. On top of that, it leaves margins of error to compound over time before the coach realizes the suboptimal nature of the specific dose imposed on the athlete. Which moves me onto this guy. Now, this is John Kiley, a prominent strength and conditioning researcher who critiques the rigid and linear nature and common practice of traditional periodization. Now, he argues there are challenges to the appropriateness of applying generic methodologies founded in overly simplistic rule-based decision-making to the planning problems posed by inherently complex biological systems. He argues that these models often fail to account for the dynamic and complex nature of individual athletes' responses to training. Kiley advocates a more flexible and responsive approach, which nowadays some coaches often refer to as Agile periodization. This guy is Mladen Jovanovic. Now, he describes Agile periodization approach as the planning framework that relies on decision-making and uncertainty rather than ideology, physiological and biomechanical constructs, and industrial age mechanistical approach to planning. Now, Agile periodization borrows principles from Agile project management from the IT industry. It primarily emphasizes on three things: adaptability, constant feedback, and an iterative process. Instead of rigidly following a predetermined long-term plan, assuming that there's predictability to prescription, Agile periodization allows for coaches and athletes to adjust their training based on ongoing assessments and emergent outcomes and needs. Fundamentally, Agile periodization is a planning framework that relies on decision-making in uncertainty and ignorance. In practical terms, a bottom-up or Agile periodization approach might look like this. How do we program around what can be done now and how? We need to embrace something called a minimal viable program. Rather than setting a fixed block of training with rigid number of volume and intensity for a given period and letting it play out in the long term, you might start off with a general framework and adjust based on how the athlete shows up and performs in the short term. If an athlete is progressing well and showing signs of readiness, the training load can be continued. Conversely, if there are signs of reduced performance or stagnation, the training variables can be adjusted to allow for more recovery or a different stimulus. Now, another leading person in the discussion of periodization, but in the world of powerlifting, is this guy, Mike Teixeira. Now, he's the founder of Reactive Training Systems, or RTS. Now, he has been instrumental in addressing these limitations with traditional periodization in the powerlifting world. He has also focused on a lot more on discussing problems with traditional periodization and periodization science. And he believes that there is a trap that the community may be over-concluding from periodization research. He points out that periodization research is normally short-term in nature, as long-term studies are impractical. He points out that studies are often group-based and have a huge variation around the average outcome, and that studies are often comparative in nature, where one protocol is compared to another protocol. So periodization research doesn't really prove what we really think it proves. With these observations in mind, in practice, we know that training plans will eventually not work after a while. When that occurs, there is new emerging information for the coach to deal with. And as a solution, Teixeira developed a framework of emergent strategies, which focuses on a bottom-up approach to programming and deals with these situations. Instead of sticking to a fixed plan, emergent strategies emphasizes on real-time feedback and adjustments based on an athlete's performance and recovery. Often, they will start with a minimal viable program, which is often in the form of a microcycle or a training week that is repeated until the athlete can no longer progress. In which case, the emergent strategies approach would suggest switching the training stimulus to something else that will help the athlete resensitize to a training stimulus. Within this framework, Mike Teixeira also attempts to quantify training stress to monitor training dose. Simplistically, emergent strategies fundamentally allows for the long-term plan to organically emerge from a repeated process of finding the next best short-term plan. Now, this approach allows for more individualized and adaptive programming, ensuring that the athletes avoid plateaus that can compound over time. And essentially, emergent strategies is a form of agile periodization with their way of approaching it. Both emergent strategies and agile periodization highlight the importance of flexibility and responsiveness to the training process. And what these coaches recognize is that there are no two athletes that are the same, and even the same athletes can respond differently to training over time. By focusing on an individual response to the ongoing adaptations, these modern approaches aim to optimize performance as athletes become more experienced. Nowadays, many coaches use a combination of a top-down and bottom-up approach to periodization. They may start with a very lean and minimalistic long-term skeleton that outlines training phases with the flexibility for things to change. Often, this is done around dates of the competition. You can incorporate bottom-up elements by continuously monitoring the athlete's performance and making adjustments as needed. This hybrid approach allows for the benefits of strategic long-term planning while also being responsive to the athlete's current state and individual needs. The important thing to note is that agile periodization, or emergent strategies for that matter, doesn't necessarily claim to be the perfect solution or solve to never plateauing, but it allows for minimizing the time spent in the negative trajectory of training. Within a lifter's journey, a common approach might start off with a linear periodization model to build a solid foundation. As the lifter gains more experience, you may incorporate elements of undulating or block periodization to continue making progress and avoid plateaus. For example, you might use a block periodization approach where the first block focuses on a little bit more volume and the second block may focus on a little bit more intensity. Now, within each block, you are likely to use undulating periodization to vary the stimulus to keep the momentum of progress. And so, when it comes to the takeaway of periodization, at its core, periodization is simply the manipulation of training variables to achieve specific qualities, skills, and manage fatigue levels. Now, training variables include volume, intensity, and frequency, as well as exercise selection as well. And by planning when you want to increase and decrease these variables, you can ensure a steady progress will avoid burning out or injury. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this video. If you really enjoyed this video, send this video to someone and subscribe to this channel, and I'll see you guys on the next one.